Throughout time, magazines have played an important role in American history, continuing to be popular despite advancement in technology. However, this doesn't mean that they haven't adapted with the times. American magazines and their publications have seen a huge change over the years of their existence, especially when it comes to how they're published. Digital magazines have become more popular today, but this was not always the case. Another big change in American history was splitting off into different kinds. Instead of having one type of magazine trying to appeal to everyone, three main types of magazines were developed with focused areas and targeted audiences. These types are news, popular culture, and scholarly.
News magazines are exactly what they sound like. They analyze and even break news stories. Some examples of news magazines are Time Magazine, Newsweek, U.S. News. Popular culture magazines cover anything from celebrity gossip to the latest fashion trends. These were developed later on in magazine history, but the first was developed in 1908. Some examples are Vanity Fair, Cosmopolitan, and People magazine. Scholarly magazines tend to be more of a collection of articles from a wide range of qualified people. Some of these magazines have a focused topic that their articles mainly cover, but some also do not have set topics and let their writers write about their own chosen topic. These actually stemmed off of news magazines. The two were blended together until the early 1900s. Some types of scholarly articles are National Geographic, Academic Exchange Quarterly, and American Research Journal.
Magazines have a huge influence on today's society. It's actually one of the main forms of media referenced when mentioning America's culture. Some examples are magazines' increased use of clothing ads using models has a direct correlation with the spike of eating disorders in our youth. Also, although most people believe that journalists are unbiased, that is not always the case. Magazine article writers have quite the influence on readers when forming their opinion, especially if the issue is about politics.
The first magazines weren't as fancy as the ones today. Their target audience was everyone who could read. It was an age of readers since neither television or radio had been invented yet. Also, the articles were much longer. It was usual for an article to be about the length of a novel and be published in a magazine as a series, called muckrakers, having a huge effect on voters, politicians, and our democracy as a whole. One specific example was Ida Tarbell's coverage of Standard Oil's monopoly. She exposed their malpractices and illegal business tactics. The articles were then turned into a book called The History of Standard Oil in 1904. She was one of the most influential muckrakers and is considered one of the pioneers of investigative journalism.
The first news magazine was Time, which was created in 1923 by Henry Luce and Brighton Hayden. The two worked together on the Yale Daily News and decided to work together on a magazine. Hayden was considered carefree and more laid back, and when he saw the Time as an important news outlet, he realized it was an opportunity to report on pulp culture. The first issue was published on March 3, 1923. Originally, it cost 15 cents, which is the equivalent in today's currency of $2.08.
The golden age of magazines was during the Great Depression hit the United States in the 1930s, and it was expected magazines would see a decline because they were commonly seen as a luxury. Magazines actually began to thrive even more, despite the radio popping up as a news competitor. In 1936, Henry Luce purchased Life magazine, and it turned out to be a photo magazine. Magazines such as Time, Fortune, and National Geographic were dominating the business in the 30s.
In the 1940s, photo magazines started to rise. With World War II at its beginning, the magazine Life saw their time to shine. Life focused mainly on advertising, showing off, and documenting the war. It showed Americans what the war was really like, and all media at the time was focused on the war.
In the 1950s, televisions became the predominant source of news in households. Magazines saw numbers dropping from their circulation, so targeting started back up again. Magazines started focusing on certain groups to attract a certain group alone. They started focusing on subjects, eventually becoming three separate groups: scholarly magazines, trade or business magazines, and popular magazines. For example, the Saturday Evening Post started up and began focusing more on popular culture, delving into the lives of regular Americans. While conformity at its peak, the Saturday Evening Post rivaled itself with other major competitors.
Magazines are different than any other type of media. Magazines began with very few people and soon became controlled by a select few. Henry Luce founded Time magazine in 1923 and began an empire. Soon, Fortune was created in 1930. After he created two stable magazines, he looked forward and purchased Life magazine. He then created a photo magazine out of it. Luce retired as editor-in-chief of all his publications and moved on. Others took over and Time Incorporated moved on. Andrew Hiskell is credited with creating a popular magazine under the name Time Inc. called People.
Today, magazine publications still have physical copies, but the start of online publications has increased drastically over the past 5 years. Magazines have seen big changes in not only the way they're published, but the way they cover and how they make their profit. Since the 1950s, magazines have gotten most of their money from advertisements instead of from subscriptions and copies sold. Since it's becoming more and more popular for readers to be subscribed online, magazine articles are becoming shorter than they were in early history. However, the type of magazine can also dictate length. For example, a scholarly article will most likely be much longer than a popular culture one.
The internet was another huge form of media that affected magazines, forcing another big change. Instead of staying with the old, magazines began going online. Adding subscription-based online magazines expanded magazines to the next generation of people in the 2000s. The newest strategies magazines have are selling premium spots for advertisers and offering incentives to subscribing to their publications. So far, magazines are back on the rise. Magazines will never die out. They have gone through two big transformations since their creation and are still surviving today just as big. Despite how big it is, magazines are most likely going to go through another big change in the near future to keep up with technology. No matter what it is, magazines will continue to adapt and survive. They'll continue to be successful in the media after all this change.